Shirley woke up screaming, louder than usual this time. Bae, Shirley's wife, bolted upright, as though someone had just run a 20,000-volt charge through her. Her dirty hand clasped over Shirley's mouth until the awful sound stopped. She whispered, "Baby, it was just a dream, just a dream." Shirley fell into a terrified silence, trying to regulate her breathing. They'd been hiding in an abandoned apartment block for 3 days now, waiting for the roads to clear so they could take the chance and move forward. Bae, keeping closer to the ground, scuttled over to one of the smashed-out windows. She stared down onto the street 30 feet below. Midnight. No stars, cars crashed up against one another from the initial panic, and thank God, none of those things down there. She breathed a sigh of relief and returned to Shirley, gathering her up in her arms and giving her a reassuring squeeze. Her body was still trembling. "What happened in this one?" Bea asked. Shirley exhaled and closed her eyes. "We were close now," she said. "We're so close, Bae. It was the dream that began this journey. The quest for the last safe place. Initially, Bae had thought it was a fool's errand. There were no safe places in this world anymore. Nowhere that the sun or its terrible monsters hadn't touched. But Shirley insisted otherwise. She'd seen it in her dreams. A place of almost mythical wonder. A vast and complex facility away from the light. Site 19. Shirley and Bae grabbed their backpacks and shrugged them on. It was best to set off now, get a few hours of walking under their belts, and find some shelter before the sun came back up. In the meantime, all they needed to do was avoid the monsters lurking out there. It was an interesting trade-off. Once upon a time, years and years ago, when the sun changed, there had been billions of those things. They were people once, until the new light touched them and turned them into these slimy abominations. There was a time you couldn't look out your window without seeing hundreds of them slithering past you. Then, they started coagulating, becoming these huge, mountainous masses of gloopy, melted flesh. It was nice that there were fewer now. Made them easier to avoid, easier to sneak around. But if one of those things found you, you were dead. Or more likely, you were about to be something so much worse than dead. The two women trekked down the side of the road, keeping to the shadows even in the dark. They were on the edge of the city now, and it wouldn't be long until they were in the wilderness. Pro: being away from a population center meant lower odds of being attacked by one of those monsters. Con: fewer places to hide when the sun came up. In the meantime, all they could do was keep walking and hope. It was an almost supernatural mixture of luck and skill that had gotten them this far. They'd known each other for 4 years when day broke, and everything went to hell. But they'd only been married for about a month. It'd been a hell of a post-honeymoon wake-up call. So many had been changed in the initial panic, and so many more had been destroyed by what came after. But these two weren't just anybody. In fact, it was the specific combination of skills and knowledge these two possessed that kept them alive for this long. In the world that came before, Bae had been a soldier who'd done 2 tours abroad and seen active combat multiple times, and Shirley had been a doctor, rising through the ranks of a local hospital. Between them, they could fight for and heal one another, despite everything. And in those early years, that's all it had been. They were always moving, always avoiding the terrors outside and the tyranny of the sun. They'd avoided the dangers that had destroyed so many others, but they'd never dared to hope. Hope was lofty, impractical. It got people killed. They'd only ever tried to survive. The immediate avoidance of death was a practical goal. Anything else was just confetti. Until, of course, Shirley had started having the dreams. Some were just fragments, like sifting through a stack of photographs in the middle of a deep fog. Others were full narratives, like movies in her head, viewed in the first person. But all of them were about the same thing. She and Bae needed to make it to a place they called Site 19. Something about it was familiar, like a thing she'd heard years ago. Perhaps from those strange broadcasts that were on every TV screen during the initial chaos. Oh, and of course, there was one more element in the dream. the one thing that made it seem more like a nightmare. In this part of the dream, she was already in Site-19 and walking down a long, dark hallway, somewhere far away from the sun. There are a series of heavy reinforced doors along the wall next to her. Each one of them had a number on them. Advancing as she got further down the hall, 029, 030, 031, 032. That's when she'd hear the voice. That awful, terrible voice. Shirley. Oh, Shirley. Come closer. Don't you want to see my face? I'm smiling, Shirley. I'd like for you to see it. She'd reached the door marked 035, at which point the door slowly creaked open. Even after all the terrifying things they'd seen in the new world, this somehow paralyzed her with fear every time. It was a kind of dread she'd never experienced before. Something that looked like black water would start seeping out from the opening door, then footsteps getting closer. A shambling figure would emerge from the open door. It was hard to make it out fully in the dark, but somehow she just intuitively knew what was coming towards her. It had a stark white face like a mask, with nothing but darkness where the eyes should be. Down below, the body, seemingly heavily injured and dripping with the same black water, was one she recognized. Her own. She couldn't move. The masked figure, this masked version of her, kept getting closer, dripping with more and more of that black water. It was shaking, almost vibrating. Then she realized it was laughing. See you soon, Shirley, it said. Can't wait for you and Bay to visit. And that was when she woke up screaming. Somehow, despite the grim ending, some part of Shirley knew that she and Bay needed to get to Site-19. Only there would she be safe, and perhaps even find the answers about how all this horror had even transpired. They were already risking their lives out here every day. Wouldn't it be worth it to find the truth? The duo continued to trudge through the night. It was, they thanked their lucky stars, a relatively uneventful journey. They encountered one of the flesh beasts on the edge of town, but they were able to hide inside a nearby bus depot until it slithered on, gibbering incoherent madness. After waiting to make sure it was gone, the duo left the city and ventured out into the Badlands. Shirley continued to insist that the legendary Site-19 from her dreams was definitely close by now. Bay looked up to the sky and chimed in, I hope you're right, honey, or you and me are fried eggs. Shirley and Bay walked for another several hours, each becoming more slightly anxious that the sun would rise before they reached ample cover, and everything they worked for would be taken away from them. The terror persisted until, against all odds, a huge black shape started to emerge along the horizon. The sight of it made Shirley's eyes widen in amazement. That's it, Bay, she said. Site-19, just like it was in my dreams. They passed the chain-link fence around the perimeter, approaching this large, seemingly abandoned building like it was the lost city of El Dorado. Bay was astonished. She loved Shirley, of course, and had faith in her beliefs, but something about a place prophesized in a dream actually being real was honestly nothing short of a miracle. The two of them approached the fortified front door and heaved it open together. Against all odds, they could see light inside the building. They still had power here. Nowhere had power anymore. Maybe this place really was salvation after all. As the two closed the door behind them, they noticed that the windows all around them were shuttered. It must have been some precautionary measure against the new sun. Smart. Whoever these people were, they'd thought ahead. They'd have some kind of preparation for all of this. So Bay couldn't help but wonder, where had they all gone now? As the two ventured deeper into the building, Bay unholstered a handgun that she'd been keeping in her jacket. It was no good against the flesh monsters, but it was a worthwhile deterrent against other desperate people out on the road. Lucky for them, she hadn't needed to fire it yet. Other than the power being on somehow, the place seemed abandoned. They traveled from room to room. Offices, filing areas, what seemed like laboratories, libraries, rest areas. There was no real indication of what these people, whoever they were, actually did around here. After searching through a few different files, all written in almost incomprehensible shorthand and code, Shirley at least found a name to put to these people: the SCP Foundation. Was it some kind of charity? They ventured deeper until they found a hall marked D-Class bunks. Inside, they found bunk beds stacked on top of each other, enough to hold hundreds of people. Bay wondered aloud whether this was some kind of secret paramilitary outfit. It was the one thing that might explain everything they'd seen here today. And in all fairness, she was at least partially right.
Okay, ladies, hold it right there.
Shirley and Bay turned around to see a man in an orange jumpsuit standing a few feet behind them. He was carrying an assault rifle and training it on both of them. He was a tall, imposing man, and yet he was shaking. Bay lowered her gun. Neither she nor Shirley said a word.
You're human, right?
He said, voice trembling slightly.
What?
Shirley replied.
Just answer the damn question.
There was a tense pause, where nobody there seemed to know what might happen to them next. The stranger's fingers started curling around the trigger. It was Bay who broke the silence. We look human, don't we? She said. Another moment passed. The gun rattled in the stranger's hands. He exhaled and lowered the barrel, taking a more relaxed stance.
Sorry,
he said.
Can't be too careful. Kind of stuff they used to keep in here. It'd give you nightmares. I'm Mike, by the way.
He approached, tentatively shaking Shirley and Bay's hands, just to prove to them that he wasn't the kind of guy who liked to gun down random women. He asked them whether they were hungry, and when they told him they hadn't eaten anything but protein bars in over a week, he told them he was about to show them something incredible. The Site-19 break room. Not long after that, Shirley, Bay, and Mike were all sitting around, enjoying some defrosted Hot Pockets. At that moment, no three-course meal cooked up by a 5-star chef could ever even compare. As they ate together, Mike told his story.
The people who used to run this place, believe me, they were nut jobs. Sure, back in the day, I wasn't such a nice guy. Me and some other knuckleheads, we needed the money, so we robbed a few places. People got caught in the crossfire. Next thing I know, I'm on death row. And then these men in white coats, they came and told me I could get a commuted sentence if I came and took part in some experiments. That's how they got me into their house of horrors right here.
If Shirley and Bay hadn't lived through the apocalyptic hell of When Day Breaks, they might have not believed Mike. He told them about how this SCP Foundation used to use humans in experiments, subjecting them to all the monsters they had locked up down here. There was this giant reptile that couldn't be killed, some freaky statue that'd snap your neck if you stopped looking at it. But the one that frightened him the most, the one that haunted his dreams ever since he got here, the mask, Shirley said aloud, lost in thought. Mike was taken aback. How had she known what he was going to say? It did nothing to reduce his fear when she told him that she'd been dreaming about the mask for over a month now. Stark white with black water dripping from it. Everyone was silent for a moment. Bay and Mike just stared at Shirley, equal parts amazed and frightened. Mike cleared his throat and told Shirley that in the years that had passed since day broke, the population of Site-19 had slowly dwindled. Monsters had escaped. The flesh beasts had slithered in and taken others. Over time, most of the staff had either died, changed, or left. All that was left here was him and the mask. Luckily for him, he'd never been directly cross-tested with it, because those who got tested with the mask never came back. Sometimes he could hear it whispering in his dreams, trying to leak itself into his mind, drip by drip, poisoning his soul. The one saving grace was that being a mask, it couldn't exactly walk up and tap you on the shoulder. All you needed to do was stay away from it, and you'd be fine. The mask couldn't hurt you on its own. The three of them carried on talking for the last hours of the morning. Night had become day and day had become night. It was the easiest way to survive these days, or at least survive as yourself. Bay and Shirley told Mike how they'd met in college all those years ago. Mike told them the story of how he managed to survive by hiding in a broom closet, while some gangly white monstrosity chased down and slaughtered the rest of his bunkmates. The tiredness took them all again, and they decided to bed down in the D-Class bunks. They were more comfortable than the bedrolls that Shirley and Bay had been sleeping on in abandoned buildings for the last year or so. To Mike, this place had been a living hell once upon a time, but now for a brief period in this terrifying new world, it could be heaven. Shirley drifted off to uneasy sleep, trying her best to ignore the whispers. In what only felt like a few moments, her eyes fluttered back open. She was in a new place, but one that felt oddly familiar. A long, dark hallway bordered on one side by a series of iron doors. She turned her head slightly, eyes still adjusting to the darkness. The number on the door next to her read 027. Further down the hall, Shirley saw a dark figure, standing tall, shoulders broad and back erect as a ballet dancer. As her vision came back into focus, she saw a shock of orange. It was Mike, wearing that same orange jumpsuit. He was standing about 10 or 15 feet away, staring in the opposite direction. "Mike," Shirley said, operating on the foggy half-logic of a dream. He didn't respond. With growing concern, she started stepping closer. "Mike?" That's when she noticed something else. Black water pooled around Mike's feet. The sight of it stopped her in her tracks and froze the breath in her throat. With an almost audible creak, Mike turned around. A grinning white mask covered up his face.
"Hello, Shirley," it said. "So lovely to finally meet face to face, eh? I bet you're so glad you ran into me. After all, sleepwalking can be dangerous."
Shirley screamed and ran in the opposite direction, wasting no time at all. She heard the slow, measured footsteps of Mike wearing the mask behind her. It was in no rush. It walked like a masked killer in a horror movie.
"Why run?" the voice said. "I've got all day, and I know you can't leave while the sun's up, darling. You and your beloved are all mine. It's only a matter of time."
Somehow, despite her being so far ahead, the voice sounded like it was right next to her ear, like it wasn't speaking out of its mouth. It was just talking directly into her brain. With every syllable, her mind started to slow, like the mask's voice was tar seeping in between the gears. Soon enough, her legs stopped working. Shirley was frozen in place, hearing the footsteps of the masked Mike behind her. Her brain was flooded with dark thoughts: death, pain, torture, grief, the final smothering of all hopes and happiness. There was really nothing like it, like every nightmare she'd ever experienced being collected into one terrible elixir and poured onto her mind. So this was what that horrible mask could do. Soon enough, the masked Mike had passed her and turned to look directly at her face. There was an awful smell, like chemicals and burning flesh. She turned her gaze downwards, seeing that it looked like Mike's body was somehow melting away from all that black water. It was like acid.
"Mike was a weak host," the mask said,
as if it was replying to her thoughts.
"He won't last much longer, but that's fine. I'm looking forward to taking you for a whirl, dear Shirley. And when your hands are mine, you can only imagine the terrible things I'm going to do to your beloved Bay with them."
Shirley, with all her willpower, was able to move her mouth enough to force out the words, "Don't you dare touch her." The monster laughed, just like it always did in her dream.
"That's not your choice to make anymore,"
it said. The mask reached for her with Mike's melting fingers, fizzling away with all that black slime, getting so close to caressing her tender cheek. All that awful silence was only broken by the sound of a soft clicking behind it, then a gunshot, passing through the back of its stolen head. The mask turned, more shocked than anything, to see Bay standing there, wielding Mike's old assault rifle and aiming it with deadly accuracy. Before the mask could breathe another poisonous word, Bay opened fire, releasing a volley of bullets into the last of its melting body as it staggered back into the darkened hallway. Shirley watched in astonishment as the creature fell, Mike's body splattering into a puddle and sending the mask itself skidding down the hallway. Maybe it was just a trick of the mind, but she could swear the mask was frowning now, not smiling. Bay breathed a sigh of relief and said, "I'm thinking it's probably better if this place stays abandoned." Shirley, who hadn't quite regained her speech just yet, just smiled, nodded, and embraced Bay. They shared a kiss, just happy to still be together and alive, despite it all. Come nightfall, they left again, in search of another place. The possessive mask remained there, laying on the floor of some anonymous Site-19 hallway, just waiting for some unlucky, weak-minded survivor to wander in and try it on. Now go check out SCP-035, the Possessive Mask, and When Day Breaks, SCP-096 to learn more about today's terrifying anomalies.